Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Live on the Orthodox Christian Network. My name is Noelle. I'm our moderator and behind-the-scenes producer, and Let's Talk Live is hosted by Father Chris Metropolis. 65% of Americans report viewing some kind of worship or other spiritual content online, which is why in 2021 we offered over 280 programs through MyOCN Community and our online partnerships, reaching over 51,000 people. The Orthodox Christian Network is a 501c3 corporation and a 100% donor-supported ministry. We rely on donors like you to keep these programs free and available, so if you're able, please consider making a contribution today. And as always, please support us through your prayers and by sharing this content with your friends and family. With that, let's get into today's interview.
Today we have the privilege of welcoming to the program Michael Jones. His wife Megan is not with us, but they're both on a missionary trip that we want to talk about. They were received into the Orthodox Church as children during the 1980s, together with their families, though on opposite sides of the country. They have 4 children. The Jones family was drawn into missionary service quite unexpectedly when they learned about the apostolic mission of the Holy Metropolis of New Zealand in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and felt a strong calling to participate. Welcome, Michael. Nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Father. It's really good to be here.
You recently arrived in Fiji as OCMC's newest missionary family and be serving there, as I said. You were trying to prepare for this service during the pandemic. What was that like?
It was tedious, I guess I could say. Everything moved very slowly. I was in Tonga 2 years ago working on the Church of St. George there that's still yet to be complete. And right before all the lockdowns started in March, I got home, and it was during that trip that I really felt strongly that it would be good for us to move here, to actually at that time to move to Tonga and try to finish the church, to oversee the project. And so the plan was to come back that same, a few weeks later with my family for Holy Week and Pascha and do a site visit, let Megan see, the South Pacific. She'd never been here. And of course that never happened. And so instead of coming back in 4 or 5 weeks, it took us 2 years to get back.
Wow.
So, and it was, of course, God's will, because it gave us time to move a little bit more slowly. Sometimes I move a little quicker in my decisions than my wife does, and she catches up, but she makes always good decisions, even if she moves a little slower. She processes things very well, and so it also gave us some time to prepare in ways that we didn't realize we probably needed to prepare, in terms of just learning things about ourselves and learning things about missions that we were able to do. So thankfully it all worked out well, but it was hard.
Good for you. Well, marriage is not necessarily about being able to look into each other's eyes, but more about how the souls dance together. So being together now in Fiji, in the Southern Pacific, which I've never been there, people would say you're going to suffer for Jesus under the palm trees. That might be a tough assignment, but nonetheless, it certainly is missionary work. And my hat's off to you. Tell us a little bit about your background, your family. What drew you to missionary service?
Sure. So I came in to the Orthodox Church with my family as part of the Christ the Savior Brotherhood group that came in the 80s. And so Megan was with the Evangelical Orthodox Church, more on the West Coast. So that's interesting. We got baptized the same year, but we had no knowledge of each other. Of course, I was about 10 and she was 3, I think. But so my parents, I think one thing that really, as I look back, really distinguishes our family, I think, is that my parents, before I was born, had really dedicated themselves to living in Christian community. So even before we were Orthodox, they recognized that was the kind of life that was the most meaningful that they wanted to live in. And so as growing up, it was a parish life, but they were very dedicated to the parish. And it was something that, growing up, being with people and struggling with those people day in and day out, sort of has always been a part of my life. And I didn't realize how formational that was, of course, until 30 something years later. but so growing up in that environment, and Megan was in a similar situation. Her parents were founders of their church in California, and among the founding group, let's say. But so grew up where that was really the center of life, even if we weren't, necessarily super, pious at home or anything. And it's just that sort of idea that we had to be together as a group. So my parents decided, when I was about in my early 20s, my parents decided to move to Kodiak and join a community there that was sort of a budding, intentional community that was going on there. And I came with them and lived there for quite a few years. And then eventually made my way up to Eagle River, Alaska, where I met Megan at my brother's wedding 11 years ago. And then we got married a year later. And so, of course, I'm skipping through quite a bit. But after about 6-7 years, after working for the state of Alaska for a while and just having kind of a good steady job with the family, and we had 3 kids and then a 4th coming, I felt a real strong calling to actually start a business. And I have background in carpentry and construction, so I started a construction business. And I was about a year into that, and I was listening to a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio with Father Paul Patitsas, who at that time was living in New Zealand, an American priest working with the metropolis of New Zealand here. And he was discussing all the things that were going on and the building of this orphanage that I'm sitting in right now, among other things. And at the end of the interview, he said, there are some of you out there I hope are listening to my words and hearing what I'm saying today, and you know that I'm talking to you. We want you to come and help. And I was painting a door at the time. I remember very vividly. And it just, the Holy Spirit kind of smacked me and said, "Did you hear that? That's you. He's talking to you." And it was very surprising, because I honestly had no idea or thought or intention of going into missions at all. We'd never really talked about it. And so I had to, of course, I felt compelled to reach out, and I sent an email to Father Paul, said, "I listened to your interview. Here's a little bit about me, and I don't know what's going on, but here I am." And he wrote back in his first lines in bold, all caps are, "I accept." It's like, I don't know what he just accepted. I'm a little nervous. But
Father Paul and I go back many, many years.
He
was one of my assistants in Denver, Colorado, at the Assumption Cathedral, and I know he and Presbytera, and they're just so dedicated to the faith. And it was really something. I heard when he went to Fiji. I said, "Where are you going? What's going on?" So clearly, he's done some missionary work, and he's brought you there too.
Yes. Yeah. And he's, this whole time he's been a big help to me. Good. Just as we go through learning, just in processing all that's going on and helping me have the right sort of frame of mind, the right phronema about missions and about coming here and being a part of this mission. So he's not here. He's in Troy, Michigan now at a parish there. Yes. But we still talk pretty frequently, and he's very much, his heart is still here in a lot of ways.
That's great. That's great. Well, look, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
What do you hope to do while you're in Fiji?
It may sound trite, but I think it's really true. I hope to learn better how to be Orthodox here. From the people who are here, a lot of people have given up a lot to be here, to be part of the Orthodox communities in Fiji and in Tonga and Samoa. They're a little bit farther behind. There's fewer people, but and the Fijian people here they're just wonderful. They're very loving people. They're drawn to Orthodoxy more because the resonance of the worship just captivates them, and they understand it. It's not a thing about theology, but to come here and to learn to maybe connect to my own heart a little bit better, maybe a lot better, but to live in the way of the heart. And I think that's very much an Orthodox way of living. And sometimes in our culture, we get up here a lot, and which is fine and it's needed, but it's not the only thing. We need to be here, as well, and operating there. And of course, I'm here to help and to serve and to be part of this community, to be just a nuts and bolts. I'm a builder, so we have some building projects, some smaller repair things that need to happen. The pandemic has been pretty difficult for all of Fiji, well, all over the world, of course, but Fiji's taken it really hard because tourism is their main industry. So everything is a little bit hard here. There's a lot of rebuilding happening. I was just in church. I know Byzantine chant, which is what they do here. So I'm helping with the chanting and teaching the children. I also play guitar and doing folk songs and things like that. So but really we're here to live with the people and to help in the ways that we can. However that turns out over time.
Well, we hope to be able to follow you as you're doing the wonderful work you're doing. OCMC.org, I believe, is the website for the Mission Center. We are very much supporting the Mission Center. We hope and pray that people will support you and your efforts there. We wish you, Michael, your wife, Megan, and let me see if I have the names of your children right. Catherine, Anastasia, Cecilia, and Elliot, correct?
Correct, yes.
We wish you all God's blessings. Keep up the work you're doing. And may God enlighten you, strengthen you, and give our regards to everybody in the South Pacific. Thanks for being with us.
Will do. Thank you very much, Father.
We welcome to our program Father Christopher Knight. He is going to be speaking in 3 sections, 3 different programs about his book, Science and the Christian Faith. I hope to learn a lot, and I hope you will too. But it's going to take some concentration. And if you haven't purchased the book yet, I encourage you to do so. So, Father, let's try to unpack this because you've got some brain trust there, my friend. What can I tell you? Let's take it in the 3 sections that you've divided. History and the current context of the debate. What is science and how should theology interact with it? And the third one, evolution and God's action in the world. Let's take it one at a time. The first one, why is science important, do you feel, for the church now?
Well, I mean, those 3 sections that you talked about, we'll deal with each of those, I think, in a different program as we're putting out 3 of them all together. And the context of my thinking about this and my writing about it is quite simply that we live in a scientific age. Because we live in a scientific age, if we're to sort of express and understand our Christian faith, then we can't completely ignore science. And there are a number of ways in which we can sort of think about science interacting with our faith. One, of course, is a very common one, I'm afraid, in the current situation in which we find ourselves, which is to say that the two are in conflict. Now, if we think they're in conflict, if we think that we have to choose between science on the one hand and our religious faith on the other, then we're doing 2 things. One is we're actually splitting ourselves down the middle because we know that we can't ignore science. And yet, if there's a bit of us that says, well, you know, science somehow is in conflict with our faith and therefore I've got to push it away. As I say, it's splitting us as individuals down the middle. And that, I think, is a very bad thing for the way in which our faith can actually mature. The other important thing, I think, though, is that we also want to be able to propagate the faith in the world in which we live. Now, there are many people out there who I think would be willing to look at the Christian faith in general terms, and the Orthodox faith in particular, which you and I share. But they won't be willing to look at it or give it a fair hearing if right from the beginning we say to them, well, you've just got to put science aside because that is something which is incompatible with that faith. You've got to choose between the 2. So that conflict thesis is one that I think we've got to be very wary of for all sorts of pastoral reasons, apart from anything else. Another way of actually going about it is to actually say, well, you know, science and religion are actually doing completely different things. And of course, there's some truth in that. Science is trying to understand the mechanisms by which the universe operates and how it's developed. So it's asking, you know, what we might call how questions. How did this happen? How do things work? Obviously, any religious faith is asking a different sort of question. It's asking why questions. Why is it that we find ourselves in a universe like the one in which we do find ourselves? And if we think they're completely different sorts of questions and they never interact, well, that is something which is often expressed in one way or another. It's a view that's particularly common in the United States in practice, because quite a lot of scientists say, well, let's just try and keep theology out of science teaching, which is actually, in my view, quite a good thing. But they say one way in which we can actually push that agenda of keeping religion out of science teaching is to say, well, they just don't interact. One's asking one sort of question, one's sort of asking another sort of question. Therefore, if you want to talk about religion in religious studies lessons, that's fine, but don't bring them into science. Now, as I say, I think that has an element of truth, but my own view is, in fact, that we can't help but ask certain questions in relation to our faith when we come to the sciences themselves. And indeed, it may be that religion itself can have some sort of input to the sciences, although by and large, the scientific community, I think, will still work autonomously. It already contains many believers as well as non-believers, and their methodology isn't strongly affected, I don't think, by the way in which they think about religion, whether they're against religion or pro-religion. So people have often talked about there being a science-theology dialogue, where science and theology, are largely independent, but nevertheless, each will ask interesting questions of the other, and will need to, take the other's perspectives into account.
Is it also, though, Father, because people, usually when people fear something, have a tendency to, in America, they call it circling the wagons. That's what the Westerners used to do when they headed west and they were being attacked. They'd circle the wagon and they'd protect, the inner home. Is it part of that too? Is it part in science and part of theology, that sort of fear? And in coupling with that has the Orthodox thinking about science even changed over years?
Well, certainly I think that fear is there. The real question is the circling the best strategy? If you're dealing with wagons, it probably is. If you're dealing with the Christian faith, if you're dealing with science, inevitably there are people who think, hang on, there are those from the other community, whatever that other community may be, who are trying to sort of get into the home territory, so to speak. So one can understand the fear, but I think one needs to overcome it for all sorts of reasons. And it's very interesting if you ask this question about the history. If we ask the question, how have Orthodox thinkers over the many centuries thought about science, we actually find, obviously, at the beginning, of course, they were more interested in a very simple thing, which was to proclaim the faith, to say Christ crucified and risen. Science didn't come into it a great deal, but even in the fourth gospel, you already have a philosophical understanding coming in, because it starts off talking about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, in English, unfortunately, we use that term word without realizing all the nuances that it actually has in the Greek. The term logos in Greek means word, certainly, but it also means things like logical principle. So it's not surprising that when people started to think about the logos, the divine word, they started to think about it, at least in part, in terms of the way in which that word was part of the sort of process by which the world was created. And when you get to the 7th century and you get somebody like St. Maximus the Confessor, he actually says, look, when we use the term logos, word, we're not just talking about the divine word, we're also talking about the word, the logical principle of each created thing. Now, obviously in his time, and certainly a couple of centuries before, when you get people like St. Basil the Great thinking about science, they didn't have a sophisticated understanding of science by modern standards. What they did try to do, though, and I mean, this goes back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries as well, was to actually use the science of their time, educated people of the time simply thought were truths, whether they could get at them through philosophy or through science, and express the Christian faith through those. So already by the 4th century, you have quite a sophisticated understanding of science, although not a modern sophisticated understanding of science, and an attempt to use that to express the Christian faith. So that when, for example, saints like St. Basil looked at the Genesis accounts of creation, they actually used what they believed could be said about the created order through the sciences and through the philosophy of their time. And they said, well, we don't read those accounts literally in the sense that there were 6 days about 6,000 years ago in which one thing happened after another like this. They said, this actually represents a philosophical truth, and we can now unpack that through our understanding of the world. So that was certainly true, let's say, of the 4th century going through to the 6th, 7th century. A little bit, even at that time, though, there were slight differences in emphasis. It's often said that when you look at the fathers of the church, you can tend to divide them. You can't always do it, but between an approach that was dominant in Alexandria and an approach that was dominant in Antioch. Now, in Alexandria, they were particularly interested in the interpretation of scripture, not in a literal way, but looking at other deeper levels of scripture. And when they tended to look at science, they tended to see the world, at least partly in terms of what they thought of effectively as the laws of physics. In Antioch, or certainly some of the later people influenced by Antioch, they said, no, when things happen in the world, it's all due to angels. It's angels pushing the clouds about and all the rest of it. So even at that time, there were differences of emphasis, some of them being much more open to science than others were. At a later stage still, you got sometimes, as I say, this sort of idea that angels were responsible for all things in the physical world. But at the same time, you had quite a lot of real interest in science. I mean, when, in Constantinople, for example, this is at a later stage now, but when they were talking, when they were educating their their future hierarchs and this sort of thing, they taught them science as well, science as it was at the time, as well as theology. It was just part of the toolbox, if you like, of the educated person of the time. And that sort of went on for many, many years. There was a bit of a problem, it must be said, after the fall of Constantinople, because, of course, the Byzantine educational system then tended to collapse for all sorts of obvious reasons because of the Turkish yoke. So that Greeks at that time, for example, if they wanted to have a scientific education, basically they went to Italy. This is now talking about the 16th century or so, because in Italy they could still get a very good scientific education. The trouble was most of their fellow Greeks back home were very suspicious of the Italians. They're Romans, we're Orthodox. So, maybe this science stuff isn't really Orthodox at all. So there was that sort of problem. There was a later problem really after the French Revolution. You actually got a lot of people who up to that time had been really quite sympathetic to science and the importance of science within the Greek world in particular, who now said, when we look at the French Revolution, cutting kings' heads off and all this sort of thing, maybe science has contributed to this. So again, a suspicion grew up, particularly in the Greek world, in which science was looked at a little bit more askance. Something similar in some ways happened in the Russian world, although it was a little bit different there for all sorts of reasons. Come into the 19th century, and of course you get the sort of the Darwinian picture of evolution appearing. And again, although there were Christians both in East and West who rather were quite happy in many ways with that evolutionary picture. Even in the 19th century, you get Christians saying, look, this shows how God is immanent in the world, that he's not an outside agent who's just coming in from time to time and doing things. God is immanent in every process in creation. And this is the way in which the creation has unfolded. And they could even look back to some of the early fathers who talked about the way in which what God created at the beginning was not the world exactly as we see it now, but what they sometimes even explicitly called seeds that would eventually come to fruition. So again, with Darwin, there was this split, if you like, between people who were very suspicious and people who really accepted it as, in some ways, actually enhancing our theology. Now, the interesting thing is that it was in the United States that a myth of some sort of conflict between science and religion actually developed. There were two writers in particular who wrote histories of mostly Western science and theology history. And they basically developed the myth of a conflict which had gone on over many years. Now, of course, it was possible to look back to certain periods when there seemed to be conflict. People often talk about Galileo, for example. But, you know, even with the Galileo situation, it was actually quite complex. He had supporters within the Vatican, as well as people who were against him. And people often get the history completely wrong. There's a lovely book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. It's edited by Rod Numbers, and it's a number of essays by people talking about the myths that have arisen about this conflict between science and religion. And as I say, in the Orthodox world, it was a little bit different from what it was in the West, not least because, of course, you know, those people, particularly in the Alexandrian tradition, were actually using Greek science as it was at the time. And for many, many centuries, that science was taught. In fact, even after modern science arose in the West, really in the sort of mid-17th century, I suppose, in its modern form, in Greece, they were still teaching the old Greek science and actually taking pride in it in some ways. Pride, of course, is a sin, but that's another thing altogether. But taking pride in the fact that this was part of their Hellenic heritage. So, as I say, the general history of science and religion is a complex one, sometimes with great support for science from the church, in particular in Constantinople at various times. There was lots of support for astronomers, for example. Mm-hmm. You know, astronomy of the sort of Renaissance period, or just before that Renaissance period, that was very strongly affirmed by the Patriarch of Constantinople.
But it wasn't a just stream of consciousness that throughout time, things have changed. There's been peaks and valleys. There's been challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about it as a general trend one way or the other. But what worries me is that, in fact, it's only in the last maybe 30 or 40 years that there's actually been a really strong anti-science thing in parts of the Orthodox world. It was there in Greece to some extent in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But there it often got mixed up with political things, you know, that you know, if you supported a certain political party, you were against science. I mean, it's a little bit like the situation in some parts of the Western world now.
Well, there's just a ton of information coming to you folks that are watching this and listening to it. I hope you will, we'll just take a break for a moment, and I hope you will go and purchase one of the books I recommend many times, you know, books that should be on the shelves in homes. This is a book that needs to be there. It's a book that you need to absorb. You need to read it over and over again. Again, it's Science and the Christian Faith. And our special guest today is Father Christopher Knight, who comes to us from England. It's a special privilege to have him on. This book, I believe, is published by St. Vladimir's Press, which is an outstanding entity that brings wonderful books forward. And again, it's a book that you want to have in your home. Father, let's take a moment now and look at two words that are put together by some folks, and I don't even know if they go together in the so-called Orthodox world. Natural theology. Is there an Orthodox natural theology?
That's an interesting question. First of all, what we talk about when we use that term is very often the tradition of thinking, which is often associated with Western Christianity, but it was there actually in some of the fathers of the East as well, in which people looked at the world and said, we can look at the world, and because it's the way it is, we can actually see it as pointing towards God. Now, of course, at one level, all Christians believe that. The psalmist says the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. But what's meant by natural theology is a little bit different. It's the idea that in some way, either by looking at the world as it is, or sometimes just through purely philosophical argument, you can somehow prove the existence of God. And as I say, it's associated in many people's minds very largely with the Christian West, especially since about the 12th century. But there's an interesting recent volume by several authors, which looks at the way in which some of those classic arguments of that sort are actually to be found within the Orthodox world, the Eastern Christian world. And so, as I say, that split between East and West, which has often been assumed, isn't quite as obviously there now as perhaps many people thought until very recently. On the other hand, I've argued that even when those arguments are there in some of the fathers, and even in some of that Western tradition, which seems to be purely philosophical, in fact, it's much more complicated than simply saying, well, there are straightforward logical arguments that point to God. A very simple example of that argument is the one that was in the 18th and very early 19th century, was due to a man called William Paley. And his argument was, well, look at the world, the way in which it's, everything in it is interconnected in this most extraordinary way. And he said, just imagine you were walking along one day and you looked down on the floor and you saw, well, you wouldn't even necessarily know what it was, but you saw a watch. And you picked this watch up and you looked at it and you perhaps took the back off and looked at its intricate workings. And he said, even if you didn't know what this watch was for, you would conclude necessarily that it was the product of an intelligent designer and maker. And so that was actually a very influential argument for at least 50 years after he first published it, because, as I say, it seemed to point to the reality of God even before God had revealed himself in historical things or anything else. It seemed to point to this intelligent designer. Now, this is a problem for us now for two reasons. One is that evolutionary theory actually points to the way in which a lot of that apparently intricate design can be understood in a way which doesn't necessarily point to a designer. Paley talked about the watchmaker. The arch-atheist Richard Dawkins has talked about the blind watchmaker of evolution. And I must say, although I disagree entirely with Dawkinson's conclusions, I think that by pointing to the way in which evolution can be seen to sort of undermine the sort of argument put forward by Paley, I think we have to take that seriously. I think God is not the sort of designer in precisely the way that a watchmaker has a designer and a maker.
Sure.
And that's really quite important, I think, because in what we might call the sort of culture wars, one of the things that's around at the moment is this notion of intelligent design.
Yes.
The idea that you can look at the world scientifically and you can undermine the idea that we don't need an intelligent designer. And to start with, for example, the early intelligent design people said, well, look at the eye. How could the eye have evolved in the way that Darwin or the neo-Darwinians think, when, what's the point of a half eye? Either you can see or you can't. Now that's fine, except it's not true that, a very primitive light detecting organ, which will eventually evolve into the eye, would have a real role in the biological world. The same was true of feathers. They said, without feathers, you can't fly. But what's the point of a sort of half feather or a few feathers? And, biologists came back and said, well, look, to start with, they were almost certainly not about flight. They were actually about insulation. And, the intelligent design people are still there trying very hard to find scientific arguments for why you need an intelligent designer. They now talk about the sort of flagella of bacteria and, quite complicated things like that. But I think it's important to recognize that most working scientists, and that includes believers as well as non-believers, don't actually find that sort of argument in any way a useful one. It's an old-fashioned natural theology argument, which no longer really works as a natural theology argument. And B, as Orthodox, we have to be very careful with natural theology, because many of the great sort of natural scholars of the Orthodox world of the last century have looked at that tradition of natural theology and said, at best, it doesn't really work. It's not really very helpful to us. And at worst, it actually takes us off down a blind alley that we really shouldn't be going down, because what, as Orthodox, we are doing in relation to our faith is not sort of standing outside the faith and trying to prove that it's got a ground in the reality of God. Orthodox theology is something really quite different. So natural theology, yeah, to be found in some of the fathers in apparently a quite traditional way, but the closer you look at it, at least in my judgment, the more you find that we actually, as Orthodox at least, have to stand back from it and say, well, it has problems. And even in its traditional forms, it often actually wasn't what it pretended to be, which was just a philosophical or scientific argument for the existence of God. It sort of smuggled faith in at various points in the argument.
Thank you for that. That's a good explanation. It's a little bit deep, so folks, you may want to go back and play it again. But Father speaks with experience and knowledge, and it's very important that we hear that. Father, you mentioned the fathers, and mind of the fathers, and tradition. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by mind of the fathers and tradition?
Yeah, I talk a little bit about this in the book because I think it's quite important for Orthodox in particular, who have this great stress on the fathers of the church, those early teachers who we see as sort of definitive for the way we express our faith, and also tradition, which is obviously linked to that. Because we are a traditionalist church. We do have our roots in the church of the apostles, of those we regard as the early fathers who taught and unpacked the Christian faith for us. One of my points to start with is quite simply a comment that was once made by Father George Florovsky, who I think is one of the great theologians of the 20th century, because he said, the point about following the fathers is that it doesn't mean quoting their sentences, it means acquiring their mind. And when we talk about the mind of the fathers, we mean more than anything, I think, a particular way of understanding from the basis of faith, how to go about expressing that faith. And as I say, the important thing that comes out of that is tradition is not simply something that was all packed up hundreds of years ago and is just given us in a box and we either accept it or reject it. It's something which goes on, it continues. It is, I mean, Metropolitan Callistos Ware has talked about this in some of his books. It is something which is the continuing life of the church in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Metropolitan Callistos made the interesting comment. I mean, when we talk about the fathers, we talk about them as the patristic writers. We talk about the time they lived as the patristic age. And he said it's very important when we read those fathers to, as he put it, separate patristic wheat from patristic chaff. Now, what he meant by that, I think, was that the patristic wheat is obvious. It's that fundamental theological insight which is expressed in their writings, it's expressed in our liturgical tradition and every other aspect of the tradition we've inherited. The patristic chaff is the fact that some of the time they express things in ways that we wouldn't now find particularly helpful, and sometimes we would find ludicrous. A very simple example is that St. John Chrysostom, one of the great preachers of the church, even 1600 years later, we look back on him as one of the great preachers of the church. But when you look at what he says about the earth, he seems half to believe in a flat earth and half to believe, well, it might be round, because of course the ancient Greeks did understand it as round. So he actually talked about the Antipodes, those lands on the other side of the world, which we would now, I suppose, call Australia. But he said, of course, if the Antipodes exist, nobody could possibly live there. Well, you tell that to any Australian now and see what sort of response you get. So Basil the Great, in a similar sort of way, got the science wrong. He wanted to make a really important point, which was that God's word of creation in a sense, continues to be active. So he really expressed what we might call continuous creation, that things are still being created now. It doesn't all belong to some period in the past. But the example he gave to illustrate it was what was believed in those days about eels. He said eels don't have mothers and fathers, they just arise spontaneously from mud. And that he used that as his example of how God's creative word continues to be made effective in the present time. Now, the theological point was an absolutely valid one. The example he gave, the scientific example, of course, we know now is absolute nonsense. There were still, in the 18th century, people who thought that some animals just spontaneously appear. But as I say, we wouldn't now regard that as a good approach to science. So when we read the fathers, and particularly when we read their scientific examples or the way they express themselves in terms of the science of their time, we do have to be careful to recognize that there is this patristic wheat, something that we don't want to let go of because it represents, the real theological insight of the saints of the world. And then there is the chaff, which is the way in which they sometimes express themselves, or even the ways that they sometimes interpreted the scriptures in terms of, the scientific knowledge or ignorance of the day, does need to be questioned in various ways. So we need a nuanced approach to the way in which we think about tradition and the fathers. Certainly as Orthodox, we must have a focus on the way the fathers thought, but we think of that not in terms only of what they said, the words of the fathers. We don't just repeat their sentences, as Father George Florovsky said. We attempt to acquire their mind. And to my view, at least, that mind in the present day means that we have to try and find ways of expressing our understanding of God's creative acts and all his acts in the world in terms of the better science of our own time. And this isn't just me, of course. There are major modern Orthodox theologians, not alive now, but Father Dumitru Stăniloae, for example, in Romania, was one of the main people who in the 20th century encouraged Orthodox to think about their tradition and to express it in terms of the insights of modern science. And that's what to some extent, I'm trying to do.
Well, clearly we don't live as Orthodox Christians in isolation. And from my history that I know, nowhere near what you know, is that we go in and the Orthodox Church baptizes the culture into which it goes. Now, today we see the so-called culture wars. So let me ask you one final question, and then we'll let you go, because we thank you very much for being with us today. This is the first part of a three-part series. How much are we affected by the so-called culture wars mentality?
I think, unfortunately, we're increasingly affected by it. And I would say that this is a very particular problem in the United States, though it's to be found elsewhere in the world as well. And obviously, what we mean by the culture wars is this idea that there are sort of two cultures, a rather traditional one and what's often called a liberal or left wing or whatever one. And each of those cultures, in a sense, represents a whole package of different sort of attitudes and beliefs. And that, again, this assumption that we need to sort of choose sides. It's a little bit like, and the assumption is, of course, often that science, and particularly evolution, lies on one side and faith and certain traditional values lie on the other. I think it's very important that we really try to get outside of that culture wars mentality. And we try and look at each issue in its own terms and really try to bring our faith to bear on that specific question without allowing all these extraneous things coming in and saying, well, people like me believe this, and this, and we don't believe this, and this. Because I think that actually works against any deep understanding and deep exploration of these issues. We are speaking, for instance, at a time when the situation in the Ukraine is at a it's a very bad and difficult situation. We all have our views on that. But if I were a Russian Orthodox, and I am in a parish of Russian tradition, though within a Greek Orthodox archdiocese here in England, but if I were a Russian, then again, there tends to be a package in Russia that says that Russian nationalism and the Orthodox faith tend to go together. And we can see from the outside how that has had very bad effects, I think, on the way in which Russian society has developed, particularly since the development of a particular sort of nationalism, largely over the last 30 years or so. Obviously, there are courageous individuals, including nearly 300 priests who have objected to the war that's going on, but they're not typical of what's happening there. So again, we can see one particular culture there, which, yes, has been baptized in the sense that Orthodox Christianity is very much part of it. But if we baptize culture in an uncritical way, then we can also fail to do what we need to do, which is to be a counterculture. The counterculture is always, baptizing a culture. We're taking what's good in any culture, and we're saying this is consonant with the Christian faith, and we can even find ways of expressing it in terms of our Christian faith. But we also need to stand outside of our culture to the extent that we can sometimes provide a critique which that culture needs. So I think this culture war issue is different in different parts of the world. As I've already said, I think it's different in the US than it is in Europe, for example, different in Europe than it is, let's say, in much of the traditional Orthodox world, where nationalism has been one of the real problems. It's not only a Russian problem, one gets it in the Greek world as well, the assumption that to be Greek and to be Orthodox are effectively the same thing. And therefore, making people tend not to see how they need to look at that sort of nationalism with a critical eye, and sometimes to actually speak truth to power. Now, that may seem to have taken us a long way from science and religion, but there's no doubt in my mind that at the moment, this apparent conflict between science and religion, which is around, is part of the culture wars mentality. And particularly perhaps in the US, though, as I say, it's not limited to the US, there is an assumption that if you're a person of faith, you tend to be anti-science. If you're a person of faith, you tend to have certain social and political views. Whereas in practice, if you look at the totality of the Christian world, you find sometimes it's a local culture war, and it's not actually something which represents science and religion, or the culture of belief and the culture of science, or whatever it may be. It's actually much more complex than that. So if we can at least step outside of the culture war, we can begin to look at some of those issues. And that's precisely why in Science and the Christian Faith, I've tried to give Orthodox Christians at least some of the tools which I think will help them to do that in relation to science. The original title I wanted for the book actually was Science and the Orthodox Christian, because it's very much coming at this issue from an Orthodox perspective. I'm a little bit critical in it of some of the Western Christian responses to science, because I do think we do have very particular insights and resources within the Orthodox tradition, which we need, first of all, to bring to bear in our own attitudes towards science, and then we need to share them in the wider Christian world. And that's my hope, is what that book can begin to do, not on its own, of course, but in relation to lots of other things.
Very good.
Signs, signs of hope in the world. They really are there.
Father Christopher Knight, our very special guest today, his book, Science and the Christian Faith. We'll be back for the second segment of that, you'll see on our website.
Thank you for joining us today. You can find all of our upcoming events at myocn.net, in addition to daily articles, live worship links, and other resources. We hope you'll join us again, and until then, thank you.